what you call it, poison.
Check it out, man. We are the ones.
This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek in Pacifica, and we've covered in the past whistleblowers, and particularly whistleblowers in tech and at Apple. And joining us today again is Senior Engineering Program Manager, former Senior Engineer Programming Manager of Apple, Ashley Gjøvik. Welcome to our show, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm so excited to be back.
And for our audience who haven't heard about your story, and it hasn't really been publicized by the corporate press that much, you were working at Apple in Silicon Valley, and you discovered to your chagrin and to your health, to the danger of your health, that there was a superfund site underneath your building. And in 2019, you found this out, and you also were fainting as a result of some of the toxins that were right below you.
Yeah, so we're merging two buildings together in what you just said, but generally, yes, it was two sites. So it all started, which I thought was kind of unrelated to the Apple story, but turns out is very related. In 2020, when I moved into a new apartment complex in Santa Clara, California. So Silicon Valley is a cluster of these suburban cities, and Santa Clara is one of them. Santa Clara was used probably out of all those cities the most for semiconductor manufacturing in the 70s and 80s. So it's pretty polluted. But these apartments, they looked like luxury apartments, beautiful. They didn't tell us that they built it on top of a superfund groundwater plume and its own local contamination in the soil and water and all of this. So there's that one, but then also my Apple office was on a superfund site, which I was warned by a friend when I moved into that office in 2017. I'd been at Infinite Loop in Cupertino, and this was a different office. And they like kind of whispered to me of, this is a superfund site. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. And then after I go through this experience in 2020, some weird stuff happens at my office. I start asking questions, and I know how this stuff works. And come to find out, I got sick at both of these places. I had started, the first fainting spell was 2019 at my office. And at that point, I had no idea what it was about. I was working full-time at Apple and in law school 3/4 time. So I just assumed it was stress because I was pushing myself so hard. But I've never fainted like that before. And it only occurred in the office. And then when I moved in that apartment, I was on short-term disability for about 5 months. I was so sick. They were screening me for fatal illnesses. They thought I could have MS. It was terrifying. And as soon as I moved out, I was better. And then because of COVID, we were working remotely. So I wasn't yet having to return back to that office, but we were getting close to that as well. And I was not terribly excited to go back to one of these sites after what I just experienced without being reassured of the safety. And then disaster unfolds in my career.
And, the idea that, on the surface, it looks very clean and well done and everything else, but beneath the surface, literally, is a superfund site. The idea of a superfund site being under your building and you're not knowing about it. I mean, it must have been terrifying that this is happening and you're trying to protect yourself and the fellow workers at the site.
Fellow workers at my office and my fellow workers, a lot of them were living at this apartment complex too. Like I wrote an article in SF Bayview when I figured out it was on the superfund site, this remediated site. And while later developments will discover, it might have not actually been that hazardous waste that made me sick. It could be a newer version that probably made me sick. But it's like, you should still tell us. And there's ongoing risk because there's other plumes nearby that can migrate. So they didn't tell us. But I published that article.
They have a legal responsibility to tell you about this, don't they? They should.
So I've been lobbying to California and US Congress that I believe we should have a right to know that extends to tenants. This is a huge gap, and employees. So the federal right to know generally applies like if you're a worker and there's chemicals that you're working with like day to day at work. So they have to give you the material data sheet. They have to tell you the risks. If you're selling real property, they have to disclose if there's contamination. But other than that, it's kind of a gray area. And so I had pushed on Apple really hard on that in 2021. Because they told me not to tell my coworkers that it was even a superfund site. They said, if anyone finds out, just send them to them directly to go, just destroy them separately than me. And I'm like, how do we not have a right to know? That my site, specifically my office, is on what's called the triple site in Sunnyvale, because it's 3 Superfund site plumes that merge into a mega plume. But the name needs updated because it also merged with at least like 3 or 4 other plumes. So it was like this 2 kilometer long, 2 mile long. And then now it's like also like 2 mile wide. It's this really gross area, and it's very shallow. So it can evaporate up into buildings, and is like houses and apartments and stuff too. So this stuff is really dangerous. And I was telling them, like, you know, you should tell us also just practically, because if there's vapor intrusion, like me fainting, I should have told EHS, because then it could tip off our HS team to go do testing and make sure everything's okay. Or if we smell something. And they explicitly told me we had no right to know, which I've been bringing up. I heard that when I was a tenant too. Why didn't my landlord have to tell me that it was built on this contaminated property? And they said no legal obligation. And I don't think that's right.
And I mean, these laws to allow construction of homes, even hospitals and facilities on Superfund sites, I mean, it seems like they were written by the developer, so they wouldn't have to tell you that you're in threat, you have this possible danger to your life and the life of other workers.
The policy behind all of this, just my mind always goes back to Lois Gibbs in Love Canal, where she had to kidnap 2 federal employees to even get the Superfund program established. It was a hostage situation. Like, it's just, yes, there's so much compromise. It's very pro-business compromise. I suspect the government fears that if they did not cave on so much of this, the industry just wouldn't participate at all and just be like, we're going to do whatever we want. We're not going to recognize your authority.
And we've just had the East Palestine struggle, where Norfolk Southern contaminated people. They refused to hire enough staff. Their train wrecks all going on all over the country on a regular basis. They contaminated the population, and then they refused to move them out, even though they're getting sick. And I heard that the EPA people who were sent there to investigate were as well getting sick from the toxins. So here they send, the EPA sends employees to investigate what's going on, and they get sick. I mean,
and they were only there probably because of the outcry. You know, everything kind of set up well for this disaster that it actually did get media coverage. They often don't, very purposely. You know, the industry silences it. So this is one that we all actually kind of got to hear about, which is quite unique. And I suspect that was probably the pressure that got them on site to actually do anything at all. But like we talked about when, so the EPA, you know, they let industry hire their own testers to test the air, the contamination, the safety. They're Tetra Tech.
Yeah, Tetra Tech is not only testing, and we talked about this in a previous show, not only testing at Hunters Point shipyard and covering up the test, $1 billion
convicted of fraud, massive fraud.
Managers, but they're involved in testing in East Palestine, and guess what? Everything's fine according to their test results. Don't worry, be happy.
I know.
Don't worry, be happy.
He's like, sure, we believe you. And I think, again, because there was actually so much attention on this one, that I suspect that's why EPA caved. It sounds like EPA did actually, you know, have an order, and they have been actually pushing on them a little bit now. It doesn't seem sufficient, but it's something. And as we'll talk through my case, I mean, so there has been coverage on my case, but like in a weird way, like they'll talk about me complaining about sexism, but refuse to talk about the Superfund stuff. So like there was some coverage, but really avoided all the health and safety issues and Superfund issues, the fraud and cover-ups, all of that. And I think that's why they've tried to get away with so much on my case, because there hasn't been that attention. No one's holding them accountable other than like me on Twitter, which I'm trying my best, but you know.
And so you discovered that there was a toxic dump site at the Apple offices, and you tried to get them to test it, to have tests from the EPA and to find out.
Actually,
OSHA.
I found out, so I knew it was a Superfund site like quietly, and I'd been whispering with coworkers, like we were uncomfortable. They weren't telling us about it and being transparent, but we felt like if we actually said anything, we'd get in trouble leading up to it. And then I had gone through this apartment experience, found out it was a bunch of toxic waste, learned how vapor intrusion works. And then Apple sends this email in to myself and then the management team in March of 2021 saying they wanted to test the office for vapor intrusion, but didn't say it was a Superfund or explain what vapor intrusion was or anything like that. And that's when I was like, okay, it's good you're testing, but have you not been testing? Because we've been here since 2015. Were you not testing that entire time? And then I'm asking like the logistical questions, because I learned also there's different levels of like, you know, the testing that was done at East Palestine, they went out of their way to not actually test, right? They're using tests that weren't going to pick up the stuff, and they were doing a very short duration. They play games with this stuff. So I was asking questions trying to figure out how they plan to test, were they going to share the results? And quickly, they did not like any of my questions. And as I was digging in the documentation, I realized they hadn't been testing since, you know, they moved people in, and there was a long history of vapor intrusion in the building. The building is vacant and gutted for over a decade before Apple rented and put humans inside.
So they actually knew, Apple, that this building site had some problems.
Yes.
Of vapor. So it's been empty for 10 years.
Yes. Gutted. So Apple was the ones that were like actually, you know, building it out, but had to follow all these rules, partnering with the responsible party who was Northrop Grumman to make sure that they follow all the circular rules. And so like the test reports from 2014-15 have Apple's name on them too. So Apple was fully aware.
And yet they tried to keep it a secret from you and other employees and told you can't talk to other employees about it.
Correct.
Is that legal?
Okay, so I am a lawyer. I'm not a practicing lawyer. Nothing I'm going to say is legal advice or official legal analysis on my case. But a lot of this stuff, you're just like, I don't know if it's legal or not, but it's wrong. Like this just seems wrong. So do they have an absolute legal obligation to tell us? As they explained to me, as I basically deposed them during that first meeting, they said that like they talked with legal, and if they're not testing, they don't have evidence we're being exposed. And if they don't have any evidence that we're being actively exposed, they don't feel like they have a legal obligation to tell us that we could be exposed, and therefore they had been not testing for 7 years.
And so you're in this site, you start to be concerned about it for your health of others, and you raise it to Apple. And what was their response when you said, let's do some testing of the vapors that were coming out?
Well, again, I want to give them, like, they were going, their plan was to test. Then they decided not to test after I started asking questions. Then they're like, actually, we're not going to test now, but for no reason. So I, you know, looking through the history, found stuff that was very concerning to me of this long history of this vapor intrusion, of increasing contamination under the building, of all this stuff. And I start pointing stuff out, and I would learn later, which we'll talk through FOIA, that a lot of stuff was going on in the background as well. So they quickly went from like, we're just having a friendly conversation with Ashley, to like, they literally said, how do you know how this stuff works? No one has ever known how this stuff works, to like, you know, ask them questions. And then the employee relations team quickly retaliated with this bizarre, she opened like a sexism investigation into my boss because I was complaining. He said, don't talk to my coworkers about safety. But then he said some weird sexist stuff too. And then she's like, well, I'm going to investigate him for sexism. And I'm like, no, I'll get fired. Don't do that. Have you ever met a hardware team in your life? Like, don't do. And then, so I realized she was doing it on purpose because she knew that would trigger a ton of retaliation, which it did. So she like opens a non-consensual sexism investigation into my boss, refuses to talk to him about the safety stuff. Like I literally in email was like, can you explain labor laws to him? Because I don't think he's aware. And she's like, nope. It's just stupid. So they're being like, I can tell already they're just gonna be lawless and retaliatory, and I'm gonna get fired. Like I'm going around asking for letters of recommendation by like May, because I'm like, they're gonna fire me, Jesus Christ. But at the same time, like I'm mad because it was clear they had been negligent with the site, and the office has like probably around 100 people in it, let alone like all the other people that are affected by that plume, which you should be monitoring the main site as you're like looking at that risk analysis for the community. And then I'm upset that they're like telling me not to tell anyone else. And then they're going to say that they're not going to test now, probably because they realize they're going to find something positive in the test, right? So I'm like, fine, you know, you're going to try to destroy me, but like, I'm going to push this as hard as I can, because this is just reckless and like inhumane. So I did. I kept pushing and asking questions, and I talked to the EPA that in April, which I also I'd found out through FOIA, caused a stir. But I was asking them like, hey, Apple's saying this stuff to me. What's your view of the legal? Like, can I talk to my coworkers about it being a Superfund site? Is it okay that they haven't been testing for this long? And EPA would kind of blow me off most of this time, but they would respond to my questions a little bit, vaguely. EPA is never helpful to the non-companies with this sort of stuff. But then Apple, even though they said, they can't outright say you can't talk to the government, even though they said we strongly prefer you work through us directly instead of talking to the government. But again, like at this point, I'm like, I'm going to burn it down. No, I'm going to talk to the government about you. So then they just continued to escalate with more retaliation. I ended up having I had two bosses. One of them just started removing me from all the meetings that I had with him and the senior staff. He removed me from projects I was leading. There were projects I needed updates from him. He just never responded to me again. I had complained in April of the retaliation and hostile work environment and was seems like my only option is just to quit. And he's like, okay. So that was that one. And then the other one's just getting really hostile and snapping at me and the don't talk to your coworker stuff. And then he quadruples my workload with a bunch of projects that will just make everyone really mad at me. And there's no way I can be successful on.
Sure.
As they do. That one's called double binding, I think. There's all the names for the retaliation tactics I learned after the fact. So everyone's just trying to make my life miserable. That employee retaliations team, I call them, is just trying to provoke my bosses, provoke me, and the environmental health and safety team, the employee relations team kind of blocked them from being able to answer my questions. We had 2 more meetings though, but they're very hostile. EHS was only allowed to read a piece of paper, clearly written by legal, that just said everything's fine, but we're telling you everything's fine, so bye. We're never going to talk to you again. There was one of those in May, and then another one in June. And I'm complaining again, and trying to, push it up to higher levels of this is clearly Apple's standard operating procedure with these sites. This isn't the only one. I found a bunch of these sites around Silicon Valley that Apple had on these Superfund sites and state cleanup sites. So I'm this systemically seems like a problem. We need way more transparency. It sounds like you're completely understaffed on this. And they really don't like that either. And then I also just started, feeling the urge to talk to coworkers more about the culture of secrecy at Apple, where they say, don't talk about anything, any of your work conditions, don't talk to anyone about anything that happens at Apple, and started challenging that too, and their surveillance. And I was quickly fired.
And they were fired. You were fired actually before an EPA investigation of the facility.
After. So I was suspended on August 4th, which I found out was actually a few days after Apple was notified they were going to be raided, basically, right? Which doesn't actually happen that often in the US, right? EPA was we're going to inspect that office. Okay. Usually they're a lot more cooperative. So that was a big deal. And then I'm quickly removed from the workplace. Oh, and then they had sent this email in June, early July. I don't think they knew what they were saying. The employee relations lady did, the sexism one, who's by the way, there's a bunch of cracks in the floor and we're going to have someone come fix all the cracks in the floor. Just bye. And I was are you aware that's how vapor intrusion occurs, is literally cracks in the floor? And an email, I'm can you please test the air before you fix them? I'd like to know for cancer monitoring. And they're no. It's just no. And then I'm getting really concerned they're going to cover up these cracks in the floor. I'd want to know how much I was exposed. And so I was remote. I was in San Francisco at that time and only some people were in the office. So I was working with some coworkers to take pictures of the cracks in the floor because I want to get the evidence. I was even with them, I was do you have clay? Can you stick it down there to see how deep they are? Really try to quantify. And I told Apple, I'm you can't just cover this up. We're going to gather evidence and see how we're impacted. Just do the right thing. And to them, the right thing was informing me I was put on indefinite paid administrative leave and there was no ETA for any updates or outcome for my career. So that was August 4th. It was crazy. And then while I was suspended, they apparently did get inspected by EPA, who found a bunch of issues. They actually had found a huge issue even before I was suspended, which I assume Apple had heard about. It's probably leading up to me getting suspended. And then I was fired about a week and a half after the raid.
And you then went to EPA, not only EPA, you went to OSHA, you went to many agencies to file charges that you've been illegally discharged. You've been retaliated against for being a whistleblower.
Before I was fired. So I could tell I was going to be fired when I was suspended, and them suspending me was any moment now they're going to, do something terrible. So, and this makes it even worse because they knew I had filed these before they fired me. So I filed NLRB charges, U.S. Department of Labor retaliation charges for a superfund whistleblower, OSHA, SOX. I filed an SEC charge. And Apple knew about all of these. They were covered in the press, big press, Financial Times, New York Times, like mentioned Bloomberg. And then they send a workplace violence interrogator emailing me with like no subject line, demanding I get on the phone with them within the hour. I literally ask if we can keep it in writing. I say, because I have my federal affidavit tomorrow with the NLRB, this feels like federal witness intimidation. I'd like to forward our exchange to the NLRB. Workplace violence says, because you chose not to participate in our investigation, we're suspending all your account access. And then like 3 hours later, I get an email from my like vice president with a letter saying I'm fired, saying I violated company policies.
And you begin to discover that, in fact, they're former government officials, including from the EPA, who actually have been hired by Apple and are involved in your issues.
Which I had been worried about, and it was confirmed later on, that I was asking because they were acting so crazy, like really just outright crazy. And they were writing it in emails. Like one of the reasons they've been so awful to me for 2 years now, it's been a living hell, but I feel like I'm in a very unique position as a whistleblower just to have so many documents of them incriminating themselves that I can give to the regulators. Doesn't happen that often, but I think they were just, going so nuts because I was pushing a lot of spots, like pointing out that they had hired Lisa Jackson, who used to run the US EPA. She resigned in disgrace due to FOIA controversies and whistleblower retaliation, which became appropriate. And she brought over a bunch of her EPA staff as well, which works with her in the lobbying organization. So like that was a conflict I was asking about. And I was raising concerns that Apple's out making all these really public statements about how environmental friendly they are and how, health and safety in the workplace. And I was like, you guys, this is like fraud. Because clearly by everything you're telling me, you're not any of those things, right? Like when I pushed on them about, telling us about the exposure at the workplace and all this, they said they don't do anything beyond what is legally required.
I think I've heard that term before for other whistleblowers. Is that Becky McLean, who is a molecular biologist at Pfizer, where there was a biological leak in her laboratory, was told that by Pfizer. We only do as much as the law requires. It sounds like it's a common operating procedure for them to tell workers who are concerned about their health and safety, we're only going to follow the letter of the law.
The trouble for them now, though, is that SEC is taking these ESG statements more seriously, the environmental social governance statements that companies will make in their little like annual shareholder things where they say how wonderful they are and everything they do is perfect. The SEC is saying, people are really actually caring about things like the climate and environment and safety now. So if you're lying on that stuff, we're actually going to say that's shareholder fraud now, because people might be buying your shares because they think you're a good company. And if you're being a shitty company, like don't lie about it. So they're actually, that's part of my charge where I'm like, they're just lying about their actual practices. So I'm hoping that maybe starts changing the tide a little bit. But yeah, I think when it comes down to it, when you have people who are like, can analytically like be like, all this stuff should be happening, it's not happening, what's your justification for not doing it? They're just we're not legally obligated. If we don't go to jail, we're not going to do it.
And there's a whistleblower protection program of OSHA, which Daryl Whitman, who was a lawyer investigator with the whistleblower protection program, he was retaliated against, and his office. 3 lawyers were fired in San Francisco at the Regional District 9 office of OSHA, federal OSHA. And you filed with them, and you also did have a successful win with the NLRB that you had actually been retaliated against. So why don't you talk about that?
So not that my retaliation case is still pending with NLRB. I'm bugging them repeatedly. I'm hopeful for NLRB now. I did face corruption up front with them, and I had to like escalate to the Inspector General's office and get stuff sorted out and transferred, which is what I'm trying to do with DOL right now because they're being a bunch of lunatics. But NLRB, I feel like, is on track, and hopefully I will be getting that retaliation outcome soon. And I'm very, very hopeful and feeling positive that they're going to find on all 3 of my charges, which was the retaliation and harassment before I was fired, me being fired, and then all their continued like harassment campaign after. What NLRB found merit in January is I had taken Apple's like the employment agreements and our like confidentiality agreements, their employee policies, like 20 or 30 different policies, and charged that they all, most of them, if not all of them, violate federal law in one way or another of, like, restricting what employees can say, not letting them talk to the press, not post on social media, not organize with each other. And even the policies themselves said they were confidential, which you can't do. Like you can't do that, because then you can never bring it to a lawyer or a union rep or something, because they'd say they fired you for sharing their like confidential no retaliation policy or something. So they found merit in my accusations that we'll find out how many violations, but some at least, and all of that. And then also Tim Cook had sent a terrible email in 2021 shortly after I was fired, saying that like anything internal is confidential, and anyone who leaks anything confidential doesn't belong at Apple, and they're going to hunt them down and fire them. And
it sounds like in response to you.
It could have been me. Someone was fired shortly after me. I'm sure they're also like interrogating a bunch of other people. I assume it's just like their general campaign at that moment of like, everyone shut up, because there was a lot of people speaking out.
Shut up. Just
yeah. So I think that was definitely directed towards like everyone still internal of like, something bad's going to happen if you try to exercise your labor rights. So just remove that idea from your head right now.
And this is important to all workers in this country, who are trying to organize unions, that there's retaliation throughout the country. Thousands of workers are fired in the United States who just mention a union. I'm interested in a union, and boom, you're gone. And it should be illegal. It is illegal, but it's not being enforced. So have the unions made this an issue, your case, and the importance of your case for workers all over the country?
I have not heard much from them.
That's
I've been a bit of a pariah, I guess, with a lot of the kind of established establishments, because my case touches upon, the wealthiest company in the whole world, and a lot of the bullshit they say about their sustainability and, safety and stuff. The Lisa Jackson, she's still on the board of the Clinton Foundation, and she's still like friends with all these politicians. Come to find out, like Steve Jobs' widow, who's still really close with Apple too, is like this billionaire hedge funder who's connected to all these politicians too. And then I'm exposing all this just like rampant corruption. So I have not gotten much support from all the kind of NGOs or unions I would have hoped I would have. And that's been a struggle for me to kind of just process that kind of betrayal. But
and my union, the CWA, I'm a member of the CWA, Pacific Media Workers Guild, News Guild. And, the CWA is involved in trying to organize Apple workers and other tech workers, Google. So you would think that your case would be important for all workers, particularly in tech, who are trying to organize and defend themselves.
There were some very divisive political campaigns by Apple. They hire the ex-FBI people, like literally ex-FBI. So all the stuff they do for like, civil rights organizations, they definitely were doing with us to try to make us all fight each other and cause all this chaos. So I don't know. I can't explain why I did not get much support.
But that should be happening, because it's important.
I would love to work with them, regardless of everything else that's happened. I still really want to work with people. I want to work with NGOs, the unions. I think even if I'm not a union organizer or a union member, I think we all want the same thing. We want employee rights. They can organize together. They can talk about safety, all this basic stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you obviously had an inkling that because of Apple's power, because of their resources, the fact that they hired the EPA administrator and she brought on her staff to Apple, that there could be collusion between Apple and government officials. So you're in this fight, you're trying to get all your cases together, your many complaints, which you probably cost them millions of dollars in legal fees.
Sometimes in my head, I'm trying to clock it, because they have different firms for different charges too. They also just added like 6 Morgan Lewis attorneys to my NLRB charges, like 2-3 partners, a previous NLRB like board member. So like, I'm pretty sure they're up at like probably 20 million or something at this point. And I'm like, you
So
could
they
have
spent a
invested
lot
that
of money
money in
fighting you, you know.
a better office that's not on a superfund site. Like, what are you doing? But they're spending all their money on their
Instead
union
of $20
busting.
million for legal fees, how to buy a better office not on the Superfund site?
I mean, that's the argument too. They're union busting these retail stores who are making incredible progress considering just how awful Apple is on this stuff. But they're spending so much money on these really expensive union busting attorneys when they could just be, you know, giving them the pay raises they're trying to get and better benefits. Instead, they're choosing to fight them, which is really disappointing.
But they don't want workers like yourself and others to have power.
No. I mean, and Apple is this kind of exemplifies this common theme across Silicon Valley and a lot of big firms probably, but like Apple prides themselves in this culture of secrecy and that no one says anything and just stays in line and loyalty, all this stuff. Like when you start, they joke about how it's basically like you work for the CIA. You don't tell anyone you work there and everything's really secret. And you have this like camaraderie with your coworkers that you can't even talk to. Like, it's just this really weird kind of cultish intelligence agency culture that Apple thinks is great. Probably because it means that very few people report the crimes historically. Like, I don't know. So I think it was very challenging for them. They haven't had a lot of uprisings in the past. So.
And you file these complaints and you are processing them. You won the NLRB decision and you've been able to get some documentation that actually shows the real role of government agencies, which should be protecting you. Yeah. So why don't we talk about your discovery of the agencies, officials, and what they've been doing to not protect you as far as your fight for justice at Apple.
It's just wild. Okay, so like everything we just talked about, right, already sounds really damning. Meaning like, please don't fire me. This feels like witness intimidation, Mr. Workplace Violence. And he's like, you're fired. You know, already it sounds crazy. And so I'd expect that I would go to the government and they would see this stuff and be like, what the actual hell is going on there, right? And go run and be like, Apple, what are you doing to her? But instead they're like obstructive and retaliating against me more and like telling me not to file charge it, all this really weird behavior. And come to find out, it's should have been expected based on, until we have that experience. I think a lot of us are just naive of, you would think that your government would be interested in protecting your rights if your employer is breaking the law. Sure. But then you learn that a lot of these agencies are in place by business interests and run by business interests. So it's kind of like where you're sent to like crush the rest of your hope and will. That's what these agencies are. And I was like, no, I'm not going to give in. So as I was like escalating the corruption, which again, I was very successful in NLRB. There was a serious issue with that first region, but the other one has been very good. I was doing like FOIA requests. I was doing that with the US Department of Labor too, trying to figure out like what actually is going on. You're acting so weird. And then that's also when I was like, I should do this for EPA too. I wonder what actually happened with my office. At that point, I had no idea there was an inspection. I had no idea EPA even was like talking to Apple directly about the office, nothing. But still, I felt like it was damning enough that I raised these questions, they're not going to test now and they remove me from the workplace. I'm like, that sounds bad. So I start requesting all this stuff. And I mean, to start with, the EPA has been incredibly adversarial in trying to getting these documents released. I filed their first request January 2022. And there's still one of them that's still open, that they refuse to give me the remainder of the documents. And they've like threatened me multiple times that they're going to charge me as like commercial, which could be like thousands of dollars to even get these documents that are like about my whistleblower claims. This punky lawyer was trying to tell me that like it's a commercial interest for me to want to be compensated for my harm, for my termination. So like
it sounds like you're dealing directly with the employer. Those are employer.
I am, right? That was what I had to come to terms with. Because I mean, even the revolving door, they want to keep a good relationship with these industries because oftentimes they want to go work for them after their current job because they can make a lot more money. So there's like just inherent coercion if there's not actual collusion. So, and then the EPA, I'd find out as documents slowly have been released. And mind you, like I'm spending, it's like a more than full-time job, not only managing my actual cases themselves, but then like the corruption around the cases and the FOIAs and keeping an eye on everything and pushing on them and escalating when I'm not getting responses. So the first thing I get from EPA Then you get January 2022. The first thing I get is end of May. They released like 1 3-page document to me, end of May, which is just insane, right? Like it's a really long time. But I will never forget when I opened that document, because like I immediately printed it out because I just wanted to lay on the floor and cry for like 2 hours. And I did. It was the inspection. It was the report saying there was an inspection of my office while I was suspended. They were looking for this kind of stuff. They found a bunch of issues. And like, there was something, I guess, cathartic for me of like, I guess it was worth it. You know, if there were issues and I exposed them and they did something, that all the stuff I've been doing, it felt, you know, I got something out of it. But then I'm like, okay, wait, how did they not tell me there was an inspection? So at this point, you know, I had been emailing with EPA until I was fired, and they were kind of blowing me off. They wouldn't really tell me what was going on or what they were doing. It sounded like they might not be acting at all. My employer, Apple's response that I got to see for the US Department of Labor claimed that the EPA told me everything was fine, like a long time before I was fired, and I was being unreasonable by continuing to raise concerns because there was nothing wrong. And then I see this, that there was an inspection and they found a bunch of issues. So I'm like, what the hell? So at this point, I'm like emailing EPA, hoping we can just have a conversation of like, hey, I got a bunch of open questions. Would love to talk to you. And they lawyered up. They're like site team lawyers. She's like, removes everyone else. She's like, hi, either your attorney or you can work with me directly. And I'm like, can you answer my questions? She's like, no, we're not going to answer your questions. So she tells me the only thing I can do is FOIA. And then I'm like, through all of this, the FOIA team's complaining that I'm FOIAing so much. And I was like, could you answer my questions like normal humans? And they're like, no. So like, we're going battling on that. But through this, so I started getting a lot more documents, I think around like August of last year. And then they were like saving kind of the worst that are still coming in now. But I learned that as soon as I contacted EPA in April, they immediately notified Apple, Northrop Grumman Corporation, and the building owner, CalSTRS, that I did so. And we're actually like drafting a draft email to send to me, telling me they ratted me out as a whistleblower to all of them as like their immediate response, which is wild. Apparently because I had called and like writ my, questions down in email, they had an email like, oh, shucks, she got to it before we could. So then they had to actually like answer them, which is crazy. And then it sounds like they were like, actually, oh, maybe we should pay attention to this site. So so the EPA took the site over in 2015-16. It had been run by the state, but it was such a risk to public health that the EPA wanted to take primary ownership of it. But that's when the Trump administration came in and the EPA was gutted and just like everything was ignored. So it sounds like the site really had not had attention like for a very long time. So they're starting to request documents from Northrop and looking through them and asking a bunch of questions that I had asked. What's going on here? Are you paying attention to this? What's going on? And so that's happening. They met with Apple in April, had a couple phone calls to try to figure out how to respond to me. And mind you, Apple's not even party on this office. It's owned by CalSTRS. The responsible party is Northrop Grumman. Apple's a tenant, but the EPA reached out directly to Apple to figure out how to respond to me about my concerns about a federal Superfund site.
So they actually asked Apple how to respond to you, the EPA?
And mind you, that's April. So that's like right before my boss's boss is like, tells me I can just quit Apple and he's going to take all my projects away. And so like, oh no, so they knew, and it really was like, they were pissed. And so then they're asking all these questions in Northrop, looking at these reports. They realize that, so subslat depressurization is a thing in these Superfund sites where they have all these chemicals like under the ground that are pushing up, and you don't want them to push up into the building like through cracks. So they'll do this thing where they'll have these kind of like vents under the floor where it gives a preferred pathway for the toxic gases to go up through these like vents up to the roof instead of coming into the building. They do this with radon too. I know. I'm like, just put concrete over the whole thing and evacuate for like 100 years.
Just the whole idea of it, of how to get vents up so that you're not going to be contaminated and poisoned. So we're going to have the proper ventilation so to allow them to have an office on a Superfund site.
Which meant they're saying I'm being unreasonable. And I was like trying to meet them where they were at with that, because yes, my like core response is, why are we on this at all? This is a danger to human health. What the F is wrong with everyone? This is crazy. But I like stifled that and was like trying to work with them within their norms. So I felt like I was trying to be very reasonable. And so it would go up to the roof, and I had asked questions that it was set to passive. Active means there's a fan that'll pull it up. Passive just means like it'll kind of find its way eventually, hopefully. And they wouldn't like tell me why it wasn't made active and all this. They apparently were asked to do their first inspection of the system on the roof in 2020. Again, it sounds like catching up after the Trump administration of actually trying to get these sites to like do their homework like they should be doing. And they hadn't sent it in. So it was still due. And it was May 2021. And they were like, hey, Northrop, where's that report? And then let's like 20 days later. And in that 20 days, Apple went fucking ballistic on me, which now I understand why. And then Northrop sends it. And it took EPA, once they got in the right expert's hands per the emails, it took like 2 hours for him to realize that Apple had completely messed up the HVAC on the roof when they installed it and set the HVAC intake like right on top of where the poison vents out. So the poison was just venting into our HVAC intake.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's like a gas chamber. It's like a gas chamber. They're
so
actually
negligent.
putting the gas to the workers there.
I can't, you have to go out of your way to be that reckless. It's just crazy. So they, the EPA discovered this in July. And this had been after EPA was doing everything they could to blow me off and get me to go away. And Apple's trying to get me to quit. And I'm like, I'm not going to quit. You're going to have to fire me. This sucks. I'm going to keep complaining about this as long as I can. And it sounds like when they saw this and there was an email, there's a few of them that I adore over there at the EPA who seem to actually care about this stuff. Like, God bless them for hanging in there with the rest of their coworkers. And I like this one. This guy had seen it and he was like, that's not appropriate. And so I think that's what triggered them to actually go on site. And I finally got a copy. They saved some of this like work stuff to like December, only like a few months ago, the EPA finally released it. And when I always complain, I'm like, why did you hold on to that so long? And they're like, because we believe we're innocent. So
they believe they're innocent. Why do they believe they're innocent?
They don't. They know they fucked up so bad. So it's like, they know, I know, we're just doing a little dance and I'm trying to extract documents as much as I can. But this one came back and it was the request for the EPA to go on site for that inspection. And the formal justification was that a whistleblower called them and expressed a number of concerns, but specifically that there were cracks in the floor. And that is a change of circumstances under CERCLA, the Superfund laws. And if those cracks are significant enough, that would be a vector for vapor intrusion. And I'm not written there, but I assumed what I was saying, like Apple's trying to cover this up. They're saying they don't have to tell you. They say they're not going to document any of it. They're not going to test before. And they did get it fixed before EPA got there. But like EPA's justification was actually, so I was like, Apple left that completely out of their response to my whistleblower retaliation cases, right? So they do go and they notify Apple that they're coming on site in Northrop Grumman again, end of July. And I'm suspended like just a few days later, which like they're extra screwed now because the temporal proximity of that is just like, duh, right? As I was actively gathering evidence and showing them, like, I'm going to take pictures of the cracks. And EPA is like, we're coming on site. And Apple's like, you're partially fired already now. Get out of here. So like, that was crazy to see. I can't believe they didn't tell me. They took for a while to like write up their notes. And actually that document I got in May was actually very light-handed, the formal version of what they did. Like they were deferential to Apple of like, based on the air conditioning, seems unlikely there is that vapor intrusion. However, your whole roof situation. But when I saw their actual like notes when they were there, it was a lot more of like, what is going on here? So I think even with that first notes, they were being very light-handed. And it took until late last year before they finally started really pushing on them as they should. And as of last month, Apple supposedly should have by now completed federally overseen and mandated vapor intrusion testing indoors and on the roof and a bunch of other testing to ensure that they don't do like fraud with the testing. They have all those special setups to make sure they don't mess with the results and all this reporting, which is like finally 20 months later. But like looking through it, it looks like they were still trying to cover for them even after seeing that stuff and seeing that they were covering up these cracks and all that. And Apple had tried to claim that any of the safety issues at the office were Apple confidential and tried to make the EPA sign an NDA. So when I complained to the regulators that Apple was telling me not to talk to my coworkers about safety, Apple denied that. And they're like, oh, we never, there's emails though of like them saying it in like the 5-point balancing test, if I want to talk about safety, that they just reduced to a 3-point balancing test after I like grieved about it. So like it was still pretty well documented. But then, you know, what else helps is an actual copy of the 4-page NDA they tried to make the EPA sign that says everything about the inspection is confidential and EPA can't make any public statements about it, only Apple can, and yada, 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 yada.
So Apple's NDA proposal to the EPA about how they should run an inspection, a legally required inspection of a health and safety danger.
And any crimes that might be found are Apple confidential.
I mean, that says a lot, you know, that Apple wants the government to sign an NDA.
Which that was one thing that the EPA apparently like drew the line on, because their email, the lawyer was like, we're not signing their NDA. So they were strategizing during that period right before the inspection of how to get around Apple being psychos. And they decided make sure that Apple's like near them whenever they're taking pictures of things. And in the moment say, Apple, is there anything you would say is confidential in the frame of this photo? And then make Apple on the spot like have to be like shamefully have to try to argue it or not and just give up. So they did that, and it sounds like they were trying to like reduce some of the like stuff that was in writing to reduce the CBI claims, confidential business information, and ultimately Apple dropped it. I assume they realized like it's all like this circle mitigation stuff and the vapor intrusion mitigation and potential safety issues. So them like on paper claiming that's confidential is not going to work out well for them. So like finding that was helpful to know though too, like no one told me anything about that. And then they're, you know, asking a lot of questions about the HVAC system. And this is like where I get frustrated too with the EPA, because I want to be helpful with the overall, like, you know, investigation and resolution. This is important to me clearly. And when they don't include me, someone with insider information willing to like tell them what's actually going on, well, they've already been misled by Apple. They didn't, so they had questions about the operation of the HVAC now that they know that it's sucking in all the toxic air and shooting it at our faces. And Apple was claiming all this stuff about like never having issues with it and everything's been perfect. And when I found that on FOIA, which was like months after they had the conversation, I emailed them and I'm like, just so you know, I'm attaching 20 emails from my 4 years at that building of constant HVAC issues, like constant, you know, so I'm kind of frustrated because like they're obstructing me from helping them too. So
but they are colluding with these companies. They're colluding with Apple and Grumman and all these companies.
So it was bad enough with this showing that they immediately outed me to these companies and told them that, you know, I'm trying to blow the whistle and like work with them on how to respond to my concerns that were like you directed to the EPA. But like another thing that came back, like a day before that inspection, Lisa Jackson had arranged to bring over the current head of the EPA to Apple Park for a fireside chat, which was like per the emails a very last minute request, which sounds like, will you come to my panopticon? I'd like to intimidate you here and show you how powerful I am now at Apple, please. Because they've gotten in trouble I've found actually a lot of hazardous waste trouble too. So they're probably really trying to avoid any kind of action on this. So they have their little fireside chat. And then I'm like curious because I saw the press coverage and I'm like, are they talking ongoing? Because that was her prior job. So I did FOIA requests asking like, what are they talking about? Are they talking? And they had several meetings, like one-on-one meetings. She had requested and tried to go on site to like the EPA headquarters to meet with him, which I assume was her wanting to walk around and intimidate all of her ex-staff. Also like weird. But like the worst one I found in November of 2021, the head of the regional office overseeing these San Francisco Bay sites had left. So they were looking for a new person. And she wrote a letter of recommendation for the person she wanted to oversee that regional EPA office. It'd be an executive level position, overseeing most of Apple's offices, and she sent the letter from her Apple email account. Like it's just
Apple giving advice to the U.S. agency which oversights them about who they should hire.
Well,
to be
they're
in
under
charge.
investigation by that agency. So, I'm uncovering this, and that's some of the stuff. I'm not going to go too much into like the corruption with NLRB and DOL here, because also I'm still hoping that they change their minds. And
But I
like,
mean, it sounds like a RICO. I mean, you've got people who are
I'm seeing
engaged.
the same crap with a lot of them, where like there's either like very clear inferred evidence of collusion and over deference or obstruction, and then sometimes just this like damning letter of recommendation, which is just so crazy. So I've had to reckon a lot with just how we live in a plutocracy, come to find out, and the whole like whistleblower hero shit's a sham, and you have an ethical obligation to bring stuff forward when you see it, but you will just be like stoned to death once you do, generally, which sucks, and it makes me really upset. So that's why I've kind of taken on this like tertiary battle of the corruption in addition to the retaliation, in addition to the safety issues, because it's so upsetting to me to see how this stuff is buried and people are harmed so much for just trying to do the right thing. But yeah, so the EPA, all this evidence, and then I'm sending that to the labor agencies. And I don't think it's a coincidence EPA is taking so long, because they're hoping, I think, those labor agencies come to their decisions without all the proper evidence. And I've told
And
them,
those labor agencies include Governor Newsom's OSHA, Cal OSHA.
so they have paused my case, waiting on Department of Labor to finish retaliating before they probably start their own retaliation. But they also said they're just like, their queue is like 6 or 7 years out.
6 or 7 years from now.
Since my original claim. So I'm at like 5 now. Yeah.
So 5 years.
Which is.
And Governor Newsom also, his environmental protection agencies, what have they done in California?
So I want to give them credit on this. They did sue Apple really hard in 2016. DTSC sued Apple. This was something I had brought up when I was complaining to Apple while I was still there. I'm like, I don't think you follow all the rules. What about this giant lawsuit you settled for $500,000 just a few years ago? And they're like, shut your face. So like I went and also requested the actual court records, because they had gone away from the internet by now. You could only see the press release. And Apple got in really big trouble for super egregious violations of hazardous waste laws. And it sounds like DTSC was going to go after them very hard, which says a lot, because DTSC usually doesn't go after anyone of influence ever. So like, it must have been really bad. And Apple settled for like $450,000. So that's the one good thing I'll give them. But I've been looking, and Apple has constant violations at so many of their stores and offices across California. And it seems like they're just written up by these local agencies, but like nothing ever happens beyond that, which is troubling. As far as my office, it sounds like they don't have any obligation, but also the office is still California government. It's CalSTRS, and they've been obstructive through the FOIA process too.
And CalSTRS, their teacher pension money, in fact, their union CTA reps on the CalSTRS board, you would think that they would be concerned about how the workers are being treated on property that they own.
Again, I was so naive when this all started. Like I had reached out to like their general counsel being like, I'm sure you're not aware. Let me tell you what's going on. And I want to work with you. And he never responded. And then like, now I'm like, you dork, Ashley, they were gonna help. And like, so the obstruction, like there's something I'm very specifically looking for. The EPA record showed that there was another environmental impact report for my office in 2016 when CalSTRS had bought it. And I thought that might be very instructive about who knew what when about a lot of the issues that were found. And I had asked EPA for it because it was in the EPA records, and they claimed not to have it. And so because CalSTRS is a government agency, I decided to do public records request for CalSTRS. And they've been very polite and incredibly unhelpful. The only thing they've released in like 4 months is a draft of the public, like the press release they did when they bought the office. That's like the only thing they've released. And they also claim not to have a copy of that environmental impact report. So like, no one's being helpful. And they've showed no interest in looking into it or partnering or anything. And then also like learning that when the EPA ratted me out to Northrop and Apple in April, they also ratted me out to CalSTRS. So
So on what basis were they ratting you out?
Oh, just well, at least the email they're drafting to me was like, oh, thanks for your questions. We've shared them all with Northrop, Apple, and the building owner, and we'll be working with them to, work on a response to you, which
Who are they representing?
capitalism.
I guess so. I guess so.
The way they drafted it would have been so intimidating to receive. I would have dropped it immediately. Maybe, I don't know. I was pretty stuck on this, but like an average person probably would be like, oh my God, like I'm going to get in so much trouble if I push on this. I'm not going to touch it anymore. Right? Like that's scary to hear. So that was rude. So, just seeing that not only were they withholding this critical information from me that was directly relevant to my disclosures and like what happened because of them, directly related to the retaliation timeline needed for my retaliation cases. If Apple's defense is I was being unreasonable and EPA didn't do anything, but EPA did a lot of things and was actually like asking all the same questions I was asking, like that's incredibly relevant. And so they're like dragging it out, I assume hoping that like they're not helping give me evidence for my cases because it would upset their prior boss. Like, I don't know what's going on. It's crazy. And like Department of Labor, they've been so terrible. We talked about this a lot in the last video. Everyone go watch that last video where we go in depth on just how awful they are. So
Marty Walsh went to work for the hockey league at a big salary after he betrayed the railroad workers, making a deal that would order them to return to work or to continue working without sick days.
Yeah.
And then Julie Sum, who it seems California is playing a big role in OSHA, the Department of Labor.
Yep.
Former Doug Parker, former head of OSHA in California, is now the head of OSHA nationally under his reign with Gavin Newsom. In the midst of the pandemic, there were less than 200 OSHA inspectors in California for 18 million workers. No increase. In fact, they can't even do the inspections. There are no physical inspections because there are no staff to do them. And they allowed Elon Musk to operate his factory, the Tesla factory, in the midst of a shelter-in-place order by Alameda County. He was able to operate that plant, and the COVID that developed there was being vectored into Central Valley, where the workers lived. They were bused from that plant in Fremont to Central Valley. So actually the spread of COVID into Central Valley was directly a result of the fact that the factory was not shut down, and Musk said, arrest me. I'm violating the shelter in place, and they caved. And the head of the Department of Public Health at Alameda County was rewarded by Newsom by being appointed to be in charge of the Department of Public Health of California.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I didn't
You can't make this up. You can't make this up.
Sure. I mean, like what Newsom's like, he's on the Getty mob too. Like there's all corrupt. They're all just a little mob.
And he's traveling around the country talking about how he's fighting racism. And he was mayor of San Francisco and he attacked the black bus drivers, terrorized them.
Island, and then he's mistreating his farm workers at his vineyard. And like what George the cat called him a haircut at one point, and I just have loved that and I appreciate that.
I mean, the hypocrisy and the duplicity of these politicians who are supposed to be accountable. And you look at California and the amount of toxic waste and Superfund sites, Hunters Point, Treasure Island, the cover up of these Superfund sites, the fact that in many cases they're in communities, Black, brown communities, working class communities, and they get sick. They have the highest rate of asthma, cancer, and they deny it. And
this is one thing I brought this up in writing to multiple people at Apple while I was still there, as I was trying to get them to care about potential chemical exposure at these offices and them not telling us they're mitigating it. They reminded them that, Apple they're claiming they're doing better at their diversity, but as they're hiring non-white people, especially like Black, Latino people, they're still in usually like janitorial roles or kitchen roles or maintenance, that kind of stuff. And those are the exact type of roles where you're more likely to be exposed to vapors at these cleanup sites. Anything around plumbing, conduits, any of that kind of stuff is where you're going to get exposed to more chemicals. So there is a disparate impact on these sites. So them not telling us what's going on, them not properly mitigating it, it's going to hurt Black and Latino people the most Native people. Like, it just factual by the way of their hiring and staff, and they didn't care. That didn't even get them to care, which was incredibly frustrating to me. I'm like, this is just environmental racism too, and you still don't even care when you're called out directly. It's a pattern. And California, I think, Apple and California are a great match because they're both incredibly hypocritical. Newsom goes out and says all this crap and does the exact opposite actually at home. And that's why I got extra frustrated with Apple too, and told them, I'm like, if you're just gonna, if you're gonna act this way, at least be honest about it. Stop lying all the time.
But it's like the fraud, we're this, we're that, in reality, the opposite.
Yeah.
And you actually filed a complaint around that fraud by Apple.
Yeah. I mean, they really they try to build this customer loyalty and shareholder loyalty by saying they do all this wonderful stuff that they actually really don't. They really don't. So, that should be called out. That should be investigated. Oh, I was going to say, one of the worst things that came out of the FOIA from EPA related to Department of Labor. So I had been asking Department of Labor to help expedite these EPA requests, and NLRB, they wouldn't help. But I was like, this is evidence for my cases. These are your like sister agencies. It's federal government. Can you please ask them to expedite or talk to them or something in ways that I can't to figure out what the hell was going on? And they refused. I get that letter in May that shows that there was an inspection, which directly contradicted Apple's position statement. And I gave that to US Department of Labor, my investigator. And she acted surprised, like, oh, look at that. Oh, that's interesting. Come to find out by FOIA results a few months later, she knew since December of 2021. She didn't tell me. She didn't tell the NLRB. She was obstructing the NLRB on my cases. So I get these emails that show that, so they were like arbitrarily trying to dismiss my case for the first time of many times back in like November of 2021. And I was pushing really hard of like, what the hell is going on over here, and FOIAing them and seeing that they were like, just being obstructive and shitty. So, and I ended up winning. They actually docketed it. But during that period, when I was pushing really hard, that's when she finally reached out to the EPA, which she should have done in the first place. If I'm a superfund whistleblower, right, and they want to understand merit, that should be your first stop before you dismiss. And she emailed, she's like, hey, but did Ashley Gjøvik ever contact you about concerns about CERCLA compliance? And the EPA is like, we should have a phone call. And they did. They had a phone call, and he was sending a bunch of documents and the emails I sent, and shared the inspection report. And that's when she got back to me. She's like, actually, yes, we are going to docket your cases. It sounds like there is initial merit. So like that one, that was frustrating that they were dismissing without investigating at all. But two, she fucking knew about the inspection. She knew I was trying to find out if anything happened like an inspection. And she intentionally did not tell me. It was public record, and she did not tell me.
So who was she working for?
If not already, soon Apple, I'm sure. This is her job interview. It's just so frustrating and excruciating. And like, I'm proud of myself for fighting and finding all this information and being able to piece it together. With the notes with this video we're going to send out, I'm publishing for the first time a document I created where I wove together the evidence like I had that I knew what was happening at the time with the evidence I found through FOIA, which tells just an incredible, crazy story. You can, and I went back kind of a couple of years on some of it too, just to show the outright like negligence and obstruction, and like they knew better and they're covering stuff up.
And
so, like,
the agencies are the inspector generals of these agencies, which are supposed to be responsible for making sure the agency officials are not corrupt. But it seems even the inspector generals, Daryl Whitman found out, themselves are conspiring to cover up and prevent investigations.
So I want to give NLRB credit that they did something, and they can't tell me what they did because they did things based on my concerns. And I did have to fight really hard. And I also worked with like someone in the general counsel's office to get like the case management transfer and stuff too. The stuff they did was really, really bad, like on paper, but they did something. So like, I want to give NLRB a little credit there. But DOL has done absolutely nothing and has actually responded to me that they like refuse to investigate complaints of misconduct.
And why is that?
We need a RICO charge. I don't know. They're just so outright corrupt. Like I could not believe that when I saw that response from them, because I had also said, I'm like, I've been reading through Daryl Whitman's disclosures from other whistleblowers, these GAO reports going back decades. And I have evidence of this stuff that's being alleged. It sounds like your guys' you've tried to investigate and you claim that there wasn't evidence, so you couldn't take action. I'm like, I have evidence on hand of them doing a lot of this stuff to me. And they said, we don't want to see it.
We don't want to see it. We don't want to see
So
it.
there's that.
And
So
Julie Sums is up for
Yeah.
Congress, whether or not she's going to be approved to the Department of Labor. Has she been informed of what's going on with you?
So I found like email lists for like talk to their headquarter office, talk to Marty, and I had sent them stuff like at first earnestly asking for intervention. Again, naive, thinking maybe they would be like, what's going on? Let's look into this. And their response ended up being forwarding my complaints to the person I was complaining about, who then just did that letter with the tracking number that says, I investigated myself. I think I'm great and I'm not doing anything you want. Love the caption. It's just ridiculous. And I was like, you ratted me out. Like, what the hell? And I tried to engage Office of Special Counsel because they had done a probe based on Darrell Whitman's disclosures. And they said they refused to talk to me because I'm not a federal employee. Even if I have evidence to substantiate a federal employee's allegations, they're not talking to me. I even tried to file like a formal complaint and they closed it immediately, saying you're not a federal employee. So based on USDL's latest shenanigans with the procedural extortion, I just reported them to the FBI and told them that. I showed them a screenshot of the FBI report. Like, I don't know what else to do. So this one, they suddenly wanted to get me on the phone in January to talk about, they said like they completed the investigation. They hadn't been investigating anything. It was clear, and they were just being obstructive and showing animus and stuff. So I didn't think they actually had investigated, but I felt like I had to get on the phone call with them. So I asked if we could keep it, like if I could have a record of the phone call. Again, that prior video, I talk about that September phone call where the Captain Para just like intimidates me to withdraw my charges for 30 minutes. On a vacation day, he was on PTO, like based on his out of office response. So I was like, I'd like a recording just so like we don't have he said, she said about whatever it is you're about to do. And they acquiesced. So I recorded it. And instead of my investigator, it ended up being that executive, the captain, which is also coercive, like having like an executive from the agency and me unrepresented. And that call was just,
And they brought in somebody to that call who you were not told about.
Yeah, I didn't know he was going to be there, and he led the whole thing, and it went like 3 hours. I do feel like he did realize that like they really didn't investigate in a way that is like enough evidence to show negligence on their part, that they couldn't just shrug it off. That seemed to be the threshold based on that conversation of like, they probably tried to not actually look into stuff, but the evidence was so damning. It seemed like he was like, okay, we got to go back. So they did agree to go back and like re-review stuff I had sent and look at newer stuff. And then they reneged like, oh, so that's when he's like, oh, so headquarters forwarded the email about where you were complaining about me to me. And I think I'm great. And here's this letter saying I'm great. Also, we're not going to re-look at the old stuff. We're only going to look at new stuff now. And I was like, okay, so transcript of our phone call, and you're retaliating now by like saying you're not going to look into stuff. So I got him to agree they'd still look into the older stuff. But then suddenly they started requesting the audio file for that phone call, which was really confusing to me because I sent them an like AI generated transcript of the call and it was procedural. They kept saying it was informal the entire time. So it was bizarre for me that they were even requesting it. And then it occurred to me like an hour later, I was like, oh, Apple, they must have forwarded the transcript to Apple, and Apple wants the copy they can transcribe to try to use like in their defense, because I was like being way softer than I should have been because he was being so terrible. But if I just like fought with him, he'd probably say I'm not cooperative and dismiss my case, like say I was whatever. So I was just kind of going along, right? So Apple's like, oh, we don't have actual defenses. Let's try this. So I'm like, no, I'm not giving you the audio file, you guys. And they asked one more time and I'm like, no, I'm not giving you the audio file. Give me some reasonable reason you want it. Because right now it just sounds like you're going to give it to Apple. And they wouldn't give me a reason. And then they sent me a letter saying they were giving me 10 business days to hand over the audio file. And if I don't, they may dismiss my entire whistleblower cases, regardless of merit. And I said, that's illegal. That's straight up illegal, and you know it. Like, it's bad enough that it was my, like, the U.S. Department of Labor case that they're obstructing and doing all this stuff. But they know I have the ongoing NLRB cases that at least like 2 of the 5 have merit already. So they're actually obstructing a federal investigation that would have been US government via Apple. And I was like, that's literally obstructing the federal government right now. What you're doing is crazy. Like, they were saying they're going to deprive me of my constitutional right to due process and my right to remedy under 3 federal statutes that Congress put in place to ensure that whistleblowers can have a remedy if they're retaliated against, if they actually, expose violations of these laws. If I don't give you an audio recording, I only recorded because of your prior misconduct, so you can give to my employer to try to use against me in matters that hopefully will end up in a criminal court. So they haven't responded since I told them I reported them to the FBI.
What are they doing with that request from you? Or charge from you? I don't know who do they hand it over to look at? The lawyers.
Oh, like Apple or Department of Labor?
Department of Labor. I mean, they're caught,
what I just
they're
did.
caught with their
Well,
pants down.
I assume because, I was like, no, it's illegal. And I hope they just back down. And then I did like another reply. I'm like, I just want to be crystal clear. It seems the only explanation is you want to give this to Apple, and that's illegal. So I will give it to you only if it's sealed. We sign an agreement that you won't give it to Apple. And they never responded. And then the deadline runs out. And the next day I said, well, you didn't do the right thing. So I report you to the FBI for public corruption, because that's what you're doing. And then when I did that, I CC'd the Inspector General's office, the Inspector General employee that said she won't investigate, that talked to Marty, that talked to Julie, Office of Special Counsel, and a few others. So I assume they're hopefully having a conversation now about what the hell is going on in that agency. It's just, this whole like putting all their corruption in formalized letters thing, I don't think was a great idea on their part. We talked about it where I just came around to it where I'm like, okay, good. Formalize your corruption. Give it tracking numbers. This whole thing. What are you doing?
So the Inspector General of the Department of Labor now is trying to decide what he's going to do about corruption in his own agency and illegal coercion of you.
But that's normal, right? The hard part is like, if they act on me, do they have to act on the other cases they do this to? So I had gone back and read a bunch of these Government Accountability Office reports, and back to the 90s, they complained that this office is lawless, just retaliates against whistleblowers, doesn't try to investigate, is just there for business interests, and refuses to actually take feedback from watchdog groups, incorporate feedback, refuses to reform in any way. And there's no point in even trying if they don't even like pretend to listen. That was the 90s.
And the US Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, know about these audits. In fact, they were ordered by the US Congress, and they just were ignored for some reason. No congressional hearings.
And this is the tipping point. And I have you encouraged me to be a little more mischievous with the way I respond to them, which I appreciate and they deserve. So I created a change.org petition a few months ago to ask them to stop doing all their corruption. And we're over 500 signatures now. And it says, I didn't realize this at first, but it emails them each time people sign and comment on the petition, which they should be ashamed of themselves. So I hope they're starting to feel that emotion. And I just want to use that moment to also, like, we were talking about unions earlier and like how important it is to be around these activist groups. As a whistleblower, you can feel so alienated and alone and easily get broken down. And one of the main reasons we need to organize is to help support each other, empower each other, give each other courageous enough to do change.org petitions to stop their corruption. So it's very important that we share knowledge, experiences, support each other, and help work together to try to reform these agencies, because they don't want reform. And I think at this point, the only way that agency is ever going to be improved is it needs to be under an independent agency or DOJ, not under a politically appointed leader. It needs to have actually like some kind of oversight and independence. And there needs to be like real full audit, and people need to be held accountable. Like, I think probably a few people probably need to go to jail for what they've done based on, what I've seen, Daryl report, these other stories. This stuff sounds like obstruction of justice and witness intimidation and witness tampering. And like US government employees should be able to be held accountable for doing that too. So,
and Errol Garland, the Attorney General, what is he doing about this obstruction of justice?
No one's doing anything. So I had filed FBI complaints, like even before I was fired, I filed one because Apple was doing some weird other stuff. And then I'd follow them as they were like terrorizing me and breaking my apartment and stuff. And then as this like corruption's been happening, and like FBI, as far as I know, has done nothing. And I was getting like kind of concerned that there could be corruption. And then as this whole story goes, quickly found evidence of outright corruption. So like I found this article that the FBI did in partnership with Apple a few years ago, where the FBI said that they love Apple because Apple helps them train their cops. And that was the San Francisco region office overseeing them, who was seeing all the like complaints I was filing. So it's like, it feels like a theater as I like file this stuff, where I'm like, I'm sending it to someone who like is probably adversarial to me regardless of the merits, but I'm gonna, to the point of, we need congressional hearings, we need actual inquiries. I want to make sure there's a paper trail this stuff is going on. It's so concerning that they feel empowered to do this, even on a somewhat high profile case with such damning evidence and all of that. Like, they must be doing this at scale.
And we're talking about thousands or 25,000 OSHA whistleblowers. The ones that have been gotten their jobs back or having determinations that have led to any action is less than 2% of all these people that have made OSHA complaints. I mean, this has all come up in Daryl's reports and audits.
It's their own metrics. It's on their website. You go right now to the metrics page for DOL Whistleblower Protection Program. And depending on the statute, you're going to see anywhere between I think the highest is 3% and the lowest is like 0.05% chance of a merit finding. And then I did the calculation because I have 3 statutes actually, that statistically, if I was to get a finding of merit on all 3, it was going to be like 0.000000576%. So, I mean, it seems though solidarity of all whistleblowers. Well, and there's a reason they cause so much division, that these companies do, the institutions do. They don't want us working together. Whistleblowers should be working with unions. We should all be working together. We want the same things. Sharing information where we can see these patterns. So we don't spin our wheels for a year hoping for the best when someone could just tell like, oh no, go check out that report. Start where they're at. But when we don't share that information and we don't partner with each other, we do just come in kind of naive, which is what they want, because they want us to waste a bunch of time and energy and get depressed and want to give up. And then if we can work together and have like actual pressure on them, they might be forced to change. So that's, I think, why they try to alienate us so much and make us feel like they spend so much time trying to gaslight me about my charges too, of like trying to make me think things were not, but I was like, there's an email that says it though. They're trying to make you feel like you're going crazy when, so yeah. Organize with people, share information, encourage each other, support each other. It's so important. And it sounds Whistleblowers United. Yeah. Yep. Hearing the other stories for the whistleblowers that get the retaliation from these agencies too is just excruciating. I have an article coming out soon that I wrote about whistleblower experiences, kind of the honesty of it. There was actually a lot of academic research about how just the brutality and kind of pointlessness of it in the United States, because everything's set up just to further retaliate against the whistleblowers and destroy their lives. And I think we need to start being honest with that before we can start real reform. Because I think sometimes these agencies like Department of Labor, it looks good on paper if you don't do any fact checking. So you're like, oh, that must be covered. Everything must be fine there. But like, it's so far from the truth. Oh, and I throw it in Department of Labor too, that if they keep doing this stuff, that I'm going to report them to the International Labor Organization, because I'm worried that the US government might be out of its like obligations with its treaties regarding whistleblower protection. I think it's some of this stuff where we need to be creative. And if you can get coalitions, you can get open letters with multiple groups signing, try to go to international bodies, really try to pressure the government to do better, to not allow this kind of stuff to go on. This seems like it's something they want. They need their campaign donations. They want to be friends with big business. So it's actually great to them that they have this agency that makes those whistleblowers go away and lets them, carry on business as usual. So there needs to be a lot of pressure to get them to actually, I think, push back on it. And of course, California, you're from California. I'm from California. We have senators who we have a vice president, Kamala Harris, past senator, past state attorney general, past district attorney, who was involved in covering up Hunters Point shipyard and the illegal activities that were going on there. It seems like they're very silent about your case.
and about the issues you've been raising, which are issues that emanate from California and Apple. Are you surprised about that?
No, I mean, so we'll link to the articles. My field notes on regulatory capture is what I called that article series as I was going through these agencies and just realizing like, oh God, everyone's bought. And then Apple realizing that they have revolving doors up to like the Biden administration, the Obama administration, that they'll have people that were leading their government affairs team that are now just like reporting to the president or vice versa, that they have so many connections that I'm just completely set up for failure in every way possible. And then finding out like these government connections or industry connections are like the board of directors of major newspapers too. It finally made sense why like New York Times was even being adversarial with my story when I found out that one of the board of directors members was also, he's like an executive at the company that had bought and renovated my office. And was like friends with Ron Sugar because he's on the Chevron board too. So like I started seeing that stuff and I'm just like
the web of corruption. But I mean, the other problem,
right?
of course,
at that point, I give up. I'm just like, it's plutocracy. Like I have no chance.
well, I mean, the other problem politically is working people don't have a political alternative. It's the Democrats and Republicans. And as you've said, under the Trump administration, they wiped out EPA and cut back. They didn't want even the facade that they were doing something.
Well, and this is a problem because I feel like Democrats have gotten stuck in this loop, which I'm sure is intentional based on like our CIA and everything. But like, you must always defend Democrats and GOP must be the enemy. And then GOP is on that side too. And I think this is especially a problem for like progressives of you kind of have a better chance sometimes with human rights related things from the Democrats. But when they fail, Democrats don't want to hold Democrats accountable. There's this huge defense of like, oh, Biden's perfect. Kamala's perfect. Don't say anything bad. When I was like, I'm concerned about Julie Sue because she's been seeing all my emails and she hasn't done anything. What's going to be different at Department of Labor? And they're like, she's a Democrat. And I'm like, what does that mean though? So I think there is this like defense mechanism where no one wants to like criticize their own party because that somehow means the other party wins. But I think we need to realize it's all kind of one party and we're all losing in the current situation. So, whatever that looks like, ideally we can get more parties, but like that's the organizing again and trying to put political pressure on them all to do better. And like you said, with the Department of Labor, like this isn't partisan. They just take turns retaliating against the whistleblowers depending on the party, right? So
it's the common operating procedure. Go after the whistleblower.
It is. So, I feel hopeless almost every day, but at the same time, I'm like, I'm still not giving up.
And you've got a record. You're tracked them.
You know what? I've made a ton of progress, especially starting this year, which I'm super proud of because it was kind of an impossible fight to begin with, both with the agencies, but also like the not support from other groups and the press and being adversarial and stuff. So like getting that LRB win and getting in the press is huge. I want it in the press too. So like employees, future or current, can like link to it, look at it, use that as leverage too for future negotiations and organizing. So that made me so happy to see. There was the whole discovering that my apartment, I got sick, probably related to Apple doing secret semiconductor manufacturing right outside my window. So that was a discovery in the last month. We could send a whole other episode on it. But
you can't make this up. You can't make this up.
So stupid. Everything is just so stupid. So that I found through public records requests. I wouldn't have found it otherwise if I wasn't diligently pulling all these requests and trying to put it together. And it was like, I got a building permit list and I saw, and I was like, that's all silicon fab. They're doing outside my window. And then I went and saw that they had these chemical releases while I was there, stuff that matched my symptoms and property damage. And so that's really damning. And it sounds like I have gotten California DTSCs looking into it, which is huge because they were very unhelpful when it was a remediation site issue. But apparently when it's a factory actively spewing chemicals into people's faces in their living rooms, they're a little more proactive.
So, do people in Silicon Valley even know about this?
This is another frustration. I've had such little luck on getting these issues covered by the press at all. I have not gotten a single reporter to be able to write that there was an inspection at my office and that the issues were found, which is mind-boggling. Because there was one from Google in 2013. Someone they wrote it up when there was a TCE issue. So there's precedent for it, but they squashed it. no one's covered this either. So like, I'm trying my best to capture everything I'm finding and to share it, but it's really disheartening. Just the press's complicity in this. It's their complicity also in our injuries, our future medical conditions, our diseases, our cancers, miscarriages, all the stuff that occurs from this kind of exposure. If people don't know what is going on around them, they can't advocate for themselves and their families and their communities. And
you know, the media, the newspapers, the TV stations in the Bay Area, you think that this would be a big story. You think that this story at Apple and the toxic dump sites and all these would be a big story, but it's silence. It's
naive
like,
Ashley thought it was when she said the frenzied emails being like, you'll never believe what I found. And then finding out that they're all owned by the same billionaires now and all the board corruption, and no one responds to me. And, you know, there are several good publications who have written about some of this stuff, like in more detail than others. I've gotten really good coverage in France and Germany, of course. Thank you, France and Germany.
Amazing? Isn't that amazing? You get better coverage in France and Germany of national publications
in San Francisco,
in the United States and in California and in the Bay Area.
It's actually not surprising at all.
It's national publicity in these countries, in Europe, and silence in the Bay Area. I mean, if that tells you about corporate media and capitalism.
Exactly. So, and then like learning about all of Apple's leverage is like just coercive too, because they have Apple News and advertising, they have the Apple TV and all this stuff. So like they have now like a soft kind of corruption of these agencies where it's just implied of if you want to keep that program, you want to have whatever deal, which is also a problem. And I hope FTC is looking in that with their antitrust probe, because I think that is a huge issue.
And it's like the drug companies and their advertising and TV.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
are they going to really cover Pfizer and the corruption and the criminality of the drug companies when they pay so much in advertising to all these TV stations?
They're on. Like I think about it sometimes when I'm watching like shows or the news, and you can see their computer and there's like an Apple logo on it. And I'm like, I bet Apple gave you that computer for free so you could advertise for them, right? So you're not going to say anything bad. Oh, so like, it's been really frustrating, and I'm trying my best to try to make it like interesting and I do have a lot of reporters that follow me on Twitter and follow the stories like carefully. You know, like they're and they'll admit to it of like not interacting because it could get them in trouble somehow, which is just absurd. Like it
also, I mean, the professionalism of journalists. Here you have great stories right in your hometown, right at where you are, and you can't write about them. I mean,
and I want to be clear. The absurdity isn't necessarily the reporters' hesitancy. The absurdity is the fact that they do have reasonable concern that they could be retaliated upon by their own publishers if they were to engage in a way that could like impact advertising.
Well, I mean, when we talk about democracy, do we have a democracy?
No, not at all. No.
When a story like yours, our story in California, can't get the sight of day in the television and the newspapers, it has to be independent media that this information comes out. That shows a systemic problem with the system.
It's gutting to me too when it's these health and safety issues. Like that apartment, a lot of people would say like they just kind of picture like a 10 or 20 unit. It's like 5,000 units. It's an enormous apartment complex. Thousands and thousands of people impacted, let alone like the businesses nearby too. Like that's a huge story. But like the property manager is also the richest property like developer in the whole country, and notoriously doesn't like bad press either. And then it's Apple, and also they have like business partnerships too. And so it's like just all rot. Like it's all rotted from the core. And it's so painful to me, like spiritually, to know that like people are being actively harmed. That harm could be avoided if our fourth estate would do its job, but it has been defanged by all these corporations that you can't even write about an active public safety issue. You know, whistleblower at least makes it like somewhat interesting too. You don't have to have the newscasters trying to figure it out. Like have someone on that can explain it, talk about it, talk to agencies, ex-DTSC. They'll get on sometimes and tell the truth.
But you haven't been invited on 60 Minutes or
no.
I think so. I mean, in some of these national news programs, CNN, MSNBC.
To be fair, there's a few where like they invited me and then they quickly said, actually, no. So I assume that was the reporter being like, this is a great story. And the editor being like, don't do it. We're going to get in trouble. which is like frustrating because like I kind of want to get on with my life too. Like I haven't had a job forever. I've like wasted all my savings are gone now. Like I need to be able to move on with my life, but I also feel like it's on me to continue advocating on these issues and lobby on them because no one else is. Like, well, you are. Thank you for having me on and sharing the story. But like, again, it shouldn't just rely on independent media. This should be something that the news is covering.
That raises the question, who is running the media? Working people should be running the media. In fact, working people, their voices are not getting out in the media. And your story is an example of that. It's an important story for not just you and your coworkers, but for all the people who live in Silicon Valley and California. What the hell is going on?
It's something I hear a lot. You know, I have a lot of people following the story on Twitter and social media, and they're really bringing it up themselves. Like, why is Ashley's story not being covered? You know, as I make these discoveries that they're like, how is this not an article? And it never is. And it's symbolic. Like, it's not just me, and it's not just this whole like situation I'm in. I'm sure I am just one of many stories no one's hearing about. I just happen to make it very, very loud on my social media. So
and you tracked it also, and you got the documentation of all of it.
And, you know, I let them do the whole like sexism whistleblower stuff at first. And I was like, but can we talk about superfunds too? And then they eventually gave up. But I had like that initial round of press, which really, I think, helped get some of it out. You know, I thought that the documentation on the safety stuff would get them like more engaged, and it actually seemed to make them less engaged. Like they're afraid because it is a real issue and Apple's probably going to get in real big trouble. So like they don't want to be anywhere near it.
Well, people can do something besides listening to the story and hearing the story. You have a petition.
Yeah.
You're to the government and you're asking for support for it so they can sign it, they can get it out. And we have to reach more people and build a movement and also bring all the whistleblowers together. And they're tens of thousands who have fought to protect their health and safety and the health and safety of their coworkers in the community, and they need support. So I think
I'd love to invite the unions. You know, the unions did do work in Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s trying to unionize these semiconductor factories, actually, those workers, because they were exposed to such terrible contamination. So there's a history, but then they kind of just like pulled away. So it's wonderful that they're helping some tech workers organize the retail stores, that sort of stuff. But like, I'd love to see them come, like invite them into the core of Silicon Valley, where you have these R&D labs, you have these factories where these people really need unions. Like when I found that semiconductor factory spewing all those chemicals next to my house, I also thought about my now ex-coworkers working in that factory, and probably like Apple being super reckless there and being like, I bet they're scared to say anything or speak up if there's issues. Those are exactly the people that need unions.
Absolutely. And of course, Apple and Google workers around the world are organizing.
Yeah.
And laws in other countries are better than they are in the United States. Not great, but they're better. And they're organizing in Japan, they're organizing around the world. So, and they're being forced to recognize the unions. So here, still, these companies like Amazon and others say, to hell with the laws. We're going to fire people. And and we're going to get away with it. I mean, there should be
Bernie comes for them. Like,
well, there should be criminal penalties to conspire, and that's what they do. Spend millions and millions of dollars conspiring to violate labor laws, and then they get government contracts, millions of dollars of government contracts after systemically violating the labor law. Why is that?
I have with whistleblowers that like our very first step in reforming the whistleblower protections in the United States needs to be that like that blatant whistleblower retaliation and intimidation needs to be not only a criminal offense, because it already is, but like more formalized. And there needs to be like a unbiased intake for people to report that and have it acted upon. Because I think if employers thought, like, remember the Tesla one where Elon Musk like swatted his whistleblower? There was a pardon trip, and like he did a false call to the sheriff's office claiming that he was there with like guns to shoot up the place, which was not happening at all. And the guy ended up getting like stuff like that. You should be able to go to DOJ and be like,
well, he was never criminally prosecuted because these billionaires apparently are above the law. There's one law for you and I, and other laws for the billionaires.
The stuff they're doing to these unions, the stuff they're doing to the whistleblowers, the employees trying to unionize, a lot of this stuff seems like it meets that threshold of at least like a inquiry into a criminal offense. And you never hear anything about that. You never see that happen other than that eBay case, I guess, that crazy, but those are reporters, not workers. But it's so rare to actually see them take any action against these
How
corporations.
about Elon Musk going to jail?
I can't imagine that ever
Instead,
happening. But
yeah, you
he's
can't
probably deserves
imagine. I
it.
think it would require a revolution in the United
I know.
States to
Or
put
it would
Elon Musk
cause
in jail.
one. I don't know. Yeah. It's scary. Like, they have so much power. And the more, like, when you mentioned that he did the, like, I'm not going to follow the law, what are you going to do about it? Those kind of threats really establish those boundaries of, like, I don't recognize. He actually,
And Gavin Newsom thanked him. In fact, Gavin Newsom just had an opening of his new office and new tech center in Silicon Valley. Gavin Newsom is parading how wonderful you are, Elon Musk.
it's so disturbing. His Starlink contract, I wrote an article about this. It had a clause that said that about his Martian colony he's planning, that it won't recognize the laws of Earth, and had his users agree to it. Like, he is just so, he wants to be dictator of everyone and do his own thing and just be openly lawless. And the more that they're condoning and enabling this, it's really scary.
Well, also the threat of a coup in the United States, an insurrection. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, another billionaire, Larry Ellison of Oracle, all were involved in supporting in degrees the insurrection. They wouldn't want a different kind of rule with one-man dictatorship, so they wouldn't be pestered with any kind of regulations or laws.
I think it's concerning globally too, because I mean, these are a lot of the technologies that people use around the world. So if whatever they end up doing, if they have so poor regulation from the US already, but if they have none, the stuff they might be able to do globally and not have any kind of way to hold them accountable for is really terrifying. And then an update on those. So I had done the public records request to try to figure out the exact nature of my office's interactions with the creation of the mass surveillance satellite program, which there's at least some. And the NRO responded and said that there are records they're not going to release because they belong to another agency. So they confirmed it. And then the NSA responded and said, due to national security concerns, we're not going to respond about your office, which is just again, I'm just what is this world that I found? So crazy.
It's outer space. It's all space. Well, I think Elon Musk has got that covered, with his contractual signing that you have to his law is going to be the law on Mars. That's
no thanks.
No thanks. No thanks to the New World Order.
I know. So I don't know. I feel like sometimes I'm just kind of like a harbinger of death, of the dystopian future, and just how we've lost democracy. I think my story is reflective, hopefully not of a full system, but at least of a partial. We've lost democracy. I'm just living in a plutocracy, and it's all corruption, and I'm having to fight for things that just are absurd and face situations that are completely demoralizing. And no one should have to go through this.
That's why we need a collective movement. People do have the power.
Yep.
And they can get together and they can change the world.
And to that point, other people who have gone through this corruption, if they want to speak up or file charges, just know you're not alone. This happens so much, and it's so demoralizing, and you feel like somehow you did it or something related to your case, but it's so common that it's pro business interests and trying to get whistleblowers to go away. So I think more people, if they're empowered to speak up, and we can have thousands of whistleblowers with the same exact story and emails on hand to show, I don't know how you get out of that. If you can get a congressional hearing, if you can get an actual probe, I'd hope that would be enough to be finally actionable.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We are having an important discussion, not just about Ashley's case, but the future of all people in this country and the world. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek, Ashley.
Thank you, Steve.